Everyone seemed to have been going absolutely bonkers for this game when it came out, giving out a downright silly amount of Game of the Year awards and perfect scores. The game is just... it's alright. It's certainly not this nearly flawless, as close to perfection as possible masterpiece that everyone loves to parade around. There are some genuine moments of creativity that elevates it above average, and the characters and acting aren't half bad. But it's got some major flaws, in particular to how the enemies are handled, that brings the whole game down a notch. The story is your basic zombie apocalypse. Infected humans have turned into ravenous monsters, and what's left of humanity is struggling to survive. The main plot revolves around gruff, middle-aged man Joel escorting a 14-year-old girl, Ellie, across the country to a group of scientists because she is immune to the zombie virus, so they're hoping to extract a cure out of her. The pacing is dreadfully slow, especially early on. It opens right when the zombie outbreak first happens and sets the tone of what to expect going forward. That's fine, I get what they're going for, and it is presented fairly well. But a big part of the problem is that this prologue takes an entire 20 minutes to get through. And there's no real gameplay, it's just walk and talk at best. Then the game starts proper after a 20-year time skip, but it's still another 10 minutes until you get to deal with your first enemy in the game. This is something you'll have to get used to with The Last of Us. The actual gameplay, which is to say the stealth segments and the shootouts, only makes up about half the game as a whole. The other half is cutscenes, walk and talk, very light exploration, and even lighter puzzle solving. I'll finish covering the presentation first before I get back to the gameplay. So yeah, a major chunk of the game is the story, but thankfully it is a pretty enjoyable one. Joel and Ellie have a good relationship between them, and there are times of bonding, concern, frustration. They go through the entire emotional spectrum together multiple times, and they play off each other quite well. Joel is cold and tries to emotionally block himself out from everyone else, while Ellie, being the 14-year-old kid that she is, she usually acts more chipper and is curious about the world and the people around her. She's a little bit naive at times, but she isn't necessarily dumb and innocent. She has a good idea of the situation she's stuck in, and she understands how serious the stakes are, which is further emphasized by how violent this game can be. The two characters eventually connect with each other quite well, but not before plenty of rough patches first.
Man, I shot the hell out of that guy, huh?
Yeah, you sure did.
I feel sick.
And you just hang back like I told you to.
Well, you're glad I didn't, right?
I'm glad I didn't get my head blown off by a goddamn kid.
You know what? No. How about, hey, Ellie, I know it wasn't easy, but it was either him or me. Thanks for saving my ass. You got anything like that for me, Joel?
We gotta get going.
Lead the way.
And what's great here is that it's not only regulated to the cutscenes. Ellie's whole body language changes afterwards too. Her arms are crossed, she doesn't hum to herself anymore, and her general dialogue is a lot more snarky. This doesn't last too long as the two of them quickly reconcile, but it is a nice attention to detail. The 2018 release of God of War did something very similar, and I wouldn't be surprised if Last of Us was a huge inspiration. Not that the concept is particularly original or outstanding, but just that it is done well here. While the two main characters are great, and the supporting cast is good too, it's the general setting that I like the most about Last of Us. Unlike the Indiana Jones style of the Uncharted games, Last of Us doesn't really have any clear-cut heroes or villains. Sure, Joel and Ellie are the protagonists and we follow their journey, and what they're doing is a rather noble cause, but everyone involved is ultimately in it for themselves and their own personal selfish reasons.
I owe Joel some favors. Is some kind of joke?
I'll cut to the chase. I need a car.
Well, it is a joke. Joel needs a car. Well, if I had one that works, which I sure as hell don't, what makes you think I'd just give it to you? Huh? Yeah, sure, Joel. Go ahead. Take my car. Take all my food, too, while you're at it.
By the looks of it, you could lose some of that food.
Listen to me, you little shit.
No, fuck you! You hand.
This comes into play more and more as you get further into the game, with characters often making choices not based on debatable notions of right versus wrong, but rather on flawed human decisions of what they personally want out of life. It's a very simple story, there isn't much in the way of complex and deep themes, but it's pretty good, I enjoyed it. It's also a good looking game too, considering this was a PlayStation 3 game. Granted, this is the PlayStation 4 remastered version playing on a PlayStation 5 console. But even so, for a game that's about 7 years old, it holds up pretty well. The environments are beautiful, they did a great job at capturing abandoned towns and buildings that have remained desolate for over a decade. The areas that have been taken over by the cordyceps mushrooms, the source of the virus, have a very haunting atmosphere. I don't necessarily want to compare this to Silent Hill, but that is where my mind goes when I see some of this stuff, and I like it. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there's some great beauty in seeing nature reclaim these man-made structures. I just really like how this game looks. They had a general theme in mind, they went for it, they stayed focused but had enough variety to keep it interesting, and it turned out well, they did a good job. Again though, it's worth bringing up the pacing. The story is split into 4 seasons, starting in the summer and ending in spring. By the time you finish summer and enter the fall, you might be thinking that you have a hell of an epic ahead of you. But in reality, half of the entire game takes place just in the summer, while the whole other half collectively takes place in the fall, winter, and spring. Furthermore, the early game has the worst of the gameplay by far, and the game doesn't really start to come into its own until about the halfway point. This makes it an annoying struggle to get through initially, and while it does get better the further in you go, I can't blame anyone for giving up early on, especially if they went in on the harder difficulties. For the gameplay, I beat the whole thing on the survival difficulty when I first played this game years ago, but I wasn't about to put myself through that again. Instead, for this review, I played the game on hard. The gameplay is a stealth action game at its core, not too dissimilar from something like Metal Gear Solid, but it is a lot clunkier and you have far fewer options to work with. It mostly comes down to sneaking up behind enemies, both humans and zombies alike, and silently taking them down. You have louder options as well, but ammo is limited and often best saved as a last resort. These kinds of games are dependent on the strength of the enemy AI. You have to rely on consistent and predictable patterns so that you can take advantage of patrol routes and get one up on them, even if that means that they'll do some pretty dumb stuff sometimes. Unfortunately, the AI in The Last of Us is all over the place. It is wildly inconsistent. Since the whole game is based around stealth, you really need that sense of consistency and fairness, or else it's going to feel cheap as hell when you lose. And it feels bad for the enemy to catch you from some absolutely nonsense angles. There's also this stupid enemy type called the Stalkers. They like to hide and try to ambush you, but it seems pointless since you can just use listen mode to see enemies through walls, and then they just run around away from you anyway. It's not that big of a deal, but it does feel arbitrary. They make it a point in the story about how the zombies are attracted to sound and you need to be as silent as possible. Except for these guys. They're the exception, even though there's no way in hell you can even tell a stalker from a regular zombie in this light. Whatever. But the worst part of the entire game is the high school. This is where I decided I was just gonna hate this game, and there's no coming back from this. No matter what, after retrying this segment multiple times, it was impossible for me to sneak up on this zombie. And my punishment was having a horde of other zombies spawn in and overwhelm me. Even if I clear the area of every single other zombie, trying to sneak up on this guy specifically would always lead to disaster, and it made no sense. After 5 failed attempts at trying to complete this segment, I gave up and decided that I can at least gun down the first zombie and thin the numbers a little bit in advance. So, what the hell then? Where are the zombies? What, they didn't hear my gunfire?
Ellie, run! Run!
Oh, you have got to be kidding me. So the zombie spawning in here was a scripted combat sequence that happened out of nowhere in the middle of a stealth segment. I don't know if I've ever had a video game gaslight me this hard, making it feel like I was the one making a mistake when in reality, my only mistake was playing this game at all. It continues when you enter the school too. It's another stealth segment, but once again, there's mandatory combat at the end of it, and any enemies who you left behind will join in. You know the deal, one guy sees you and all of a sudden everyone within a square mile knows exactly where you are.
Looks like there's a path down this hallway. Phil, I need your help with this door. We gotta clear these guys first.
However, if you deal with all the enemies as you progress through here, then the zombies that are just around the corner won't have heard you because they hadn't spawned in yet. It is so poorly implemented and unbelievably cheap. This is win-back levels of garbage, and that was for the PlayStation 2, not to mention the Nintendo 64. It is absurd what they try to get away with here. I swear, it is not difficult to find idiotic stuff like this. I can get spotted from quite literally impossible angles that make no sense.
You went behind the house.
And to make matters worse, apparently there's just a dude in this house with full armor and a shotgun hiding out in a room by himself just on the off chance that I'll be coming by. It is so stupid. I guess that's my fault for wanting to explore the map. Like I said before, it does get better as you progress further into the game. The scripted shenanigans become less frequent and the pacing does start to pick up. But some of these select moments, pretty much the whole first half of the game, were infuriating simply due to very poor design decisions. The game is based around limited supplies and easy deaths, so it's cheap and unfun when it ends up cheating or otherwise has unpredicted scripted sequences. However, if you're willing to brave through the worst of it, then you'll find that the game does allow for some cool stuff, like drawing a group of enemies to a single sound source and then hitting them all at once with a grenade. It's kind of cool, and these stronger weapons are reined in with a simple crafting system. I guess the zombies are the horror aspect, so this would cover the survival. Much of the game is exploring and collecting materials to form into various tools, with the harder difficulties being a lot more stingy with the supplies. The limited inventory space also forces the player to make choices on what to build, but it's not so stifling as to be annoying. This aspect of the game is fairly well done, and surprisingly, so are the cover shooter segments. By having an emphasis on making every shot count, and on both the enemies and the players having very low health, the battles can be very tense and fun. It is undermined a little bit due to enemies ignoring your AI partners while you're sneaking around, and there isn't really a good excuse for that, but at least it doesn't ruin the gameplay either. On top of several craftable items, you also get quite the arsenal of weapons, including 2 different pistols, 2 different shotguns, a sniper rifle, bow and arrows, and even a flamethrower near the end of the game. Each weapon can have its stats upgraded little by little, although the last weapon is really overpowered right out the gate. You get plenty of ammo for it, and it only takes a small puff of fire to kill someone. This makes the final combat segment surprisingly a bit of a cakewalk. But for the most part, the combat's not half bad. I'd rather take the vast freedom of options and much more fluid controls that something like Metal Gear Solid 5 offers, but for something that's supposed to come off as more grounded and realistic, it's alright. The original PlayStation 3 release had a paid DLC single-player chapter, and it's included with this remastered version. You play as Ellie, taking place both during a time skip in the winter of the main story, as well as occasional flashbacks into her past. This DLC is really, really bad. The gameplay segments involve the usual sneaking around zombies and humans, but almost all of it is very piss poor up until the very end. I'm talking about, like, the last 15 minutes at most, but that's out of a 2-hour story. As for the story itself, it's not much better. The premise is okay, I can see what they're going for, but just like the main game, it also has a problem with being so slow. I guess I'm supposed to feel empathy for these two teenage girls in a zombie apocalypse, and that's fine, but geez, can we pick up the pace? I literally fell asleep in the middle of this one. The place in the main story that this is supposed to take place in, as well as the plot and the lore that's revealed, makes me think that this might have been cut content that was instead repackaged and sold off for an easy buck. Whatever the case may be, I kind of wish it stayed as cut content. It has a moment or two that's cool, and if you're really into these characters in this world, then you might get more of a kick out of it, but I think for most people, there's really not anything to see here. And that leaves the final piece to talk about, the multiplayer. Occasionally, you'll get a game like Resident Evil 6 where the main campaign isn't anything too special, but the additional content turns out to be amazing. So, is that the case with The Last of Us multiplayer? Actually, it comes really close. There is a lot to like here, but it's practically ruined by a couple of totally asinine design decisions. There's only 3 game modes, which is pretty limiting, but nothing I would call a severe detriment. The most interesting one is a creative, if not morbid, take on Capture the Flag. You have to interrogate enemy players to reveal the opposing team's safe, and then spend time opening that safe, while also defending yours if the enemy has discovered your own safe. It's pretty cool, this works out rather well. The other 2 game modes are just variations on traditional team deathmatch, nothing real special here. There's a grand total of 27 maps. That's a lot, and they're all good. None of them are either too big or too small. There's plenty of cover, wide open areas, and sniper perches to choose from. And all the individual areas look unique and have their own little landmarks, so it's easy to call out a location to a friend and coordinate on the fly. They did good here. I really like the level design of these maps. There's loadout customization too, where you choose between several different weapons and perks, all of which are very different from each other and adhere to just about anyone's personal playstyle. Surprisingly, they also brought over a lot of the nuances from the single-player mode. You have to collect materials and craft supplies on the field, and you can even use the listen mode to find enemies who are moving around. Although this time it's tied to a meter, so you can't just abuse it. It still plays a little bit janky, just like in the single player, but it all manages to work out well. This is actually good. So what are those oh so terrible negatives? Well, the netcode is a bit off. It's not as bad as Metal Gear Solid 5's online multiplayer, which was really off, but at least that was consistent and you can kind of get used to it. But it is unfortunate that Last of Us has a similar issue, like getting shot in the head after you already took cover. Now I'm sure it's just the online information trying to catch up, but it always feels bad when it happens. Also, when I try playing with a friend, the matchmaking has a chance to place us on separate teams, which is a bit pointless, not to mention that it's not uncommon to get into a match with unbalanced teams. However, with all that being said, I can still push forward and enjoy it despite the negatives. But the real killing blow is the pay-to-win DLC. There are a lot of weapons and perks blocked behind a paywall, and it would cost $24 to buy all the bundles. If you just wanted something specific, then sure, most of the individual guns only cost $1. Why the hell does the grenade launcher cost $2.50? This is ridiculous. Now, in my heart, I want to believe that this game is reasonably well balanced, and buying this stuff isn't going to significantly tip the scales. But I have no way of knowing that without putting down additional money on top of what I already paid for the game, and it doesn't help that I keep getting taken out by a DLC gun. Maybe you can say that I'm whining over nothing, maybe you think that the game is still well balanced overall, and that's fine, I'm not gonna argue against that. But just based on principle alone, I refuse to support this. It's a damn shame because my brother and I put a lot of hours into this and we liked it a lot. But there was always that nagging feeling in the back of our heads, and it's such a shame. At least, if nothing else, the game does seem fairly well populated even today, so you shouldn't have too hard of a time finding matches. Well, that's just about everything I have to say on The Last of Us. Overall, it's fine. It's a lot more creative and interesting than Naughty Dog's other recent games, the Uncharted series, but that's not really saying much, and even then, it's not that much better. When Last of Us is good, it's really good, but then half the gameplay segments are also so bad, and there is so much filler in the form of cutscenes and a ton of dialogue. It's not a bad game, but I don't want to recommend it because 40% of it could be boring, another 40% of it is just straight up busted, and then you have that last 20% that's actually good. But it is not worth trudging through the trash to get there. Thanks for watching my review on The Last of Us, and thanks to my good buddy Zoobity Doodoo Pop for joining me in gathering the multiplayer footage. I'll look into covering the sequel for the next review.